very happy to welcome you all back for the event entitled The Invisible Arab, The Promise and Peril of Arab Revolutions, which is the title of a new book by Mr. Marwan Bishara, who is a senior political analyst at Jazeera English. We're really delighted to have him with us today. He's the editor and host of its flagship show, Empire, a program that examines global powers and their agendas, and his writing has appeared in the New York Times, the International Herald Tribune, the Washington Post, and a variety of other important media outlets. So I will ask you to join me in welcoming Mr. Bishara to tell us about The Invisible Arab, The Promise and Peril of Arab Revolutions, and then we'll have a question and answer session as well. And of course, the book is available for purchase here in the corner of the room. One last note, those watching on the live stream, we encourage you to participate in the discussion through Facebook or through the chat roll on our live stream webpage, and send in your questions as well via Twitter by tagging @Palestine Center. So please welcome Mr. Marwan Bishara.
Wonderful to be here with you. It's such a beautiful weather. I don't know what you're doing inside or indoors. If I were you, well, I'm not going to tell you if I were you what I would be doing. I've been finding it over the last few weeks to speak about the book by referring to some of the words on the cover. I think it's probably the easiest thing. So to speak about the invisible and the Arab and the pearls and the promise, I think that would probably cover it. What I will try to do is maybe just delineate those issues to you, and then maybe we could have a discussion, which probably be more of interest for many after falafel and shawarma and whatever. The invisible actually is quite important. The invisible part of it. It's because we are here in Washington, and I think invisible is more relevant to American mainstream media and academia, Western mainstream and academia, than it is to other parts of the world. For the last several decades, for some of us who actually lived in this country, went to school in this country, and are familiar with mainstream media, it's clear to us that for the last several decades, the Arabs, indeed Muslims in general, have been missing from the Arab from the media narrative. And missing in what sense? I mean, there've been conversations about Islam, especially as of late, but there have been no serious attempt at understanding Muslims or Arabs in the region. And that's for three reasons. And again, they are centered here where we are in Washington. One is that of energy security. The United States and its mainstream media and academia looked at the region through the prisms of oil. So it was mostly a question of energy security. It was mostly the question of, if the oil prices goes up, you will see the images of Arabs, as Jacques Shaheen and others will tell you, quite negative in the media, in Hollywood, and so on and so forth. And at best, the Arabs would be those who are trying to take control of their national resources and deny America access to oil. Or it would be that of Israel's security. If it's not energy security, it's Israel's security. The Arabs were seen from the prisms of what is good and what is not good for so-called Israel's security. And third, it was, of course, especially of late, that of U.S. national security. And here, of course, they've been seen from the prisms of terrorism and the war on terror. So any way you look at it from those three prisms, American mainstream media and arguably academia, and certainly policymaking, looked at the region, looked at Arabs in all three levels, from all three perspectives, from all three angles and prisms, as enemies. The Arabs were the enemy. They were the enemy in terms of energy security, they were the enemy in terms of Israel's security, and they were the enemies in terms of national security and terrorism. So an Arab could not have been seen as what the Arabs turned out to be in 2011. So the shock wasn't just a shock of a question of contagion or a question of, did we expect it? Did we not expect it? Was it surprising? Was it shocking? It was more than that. It was, these Arabs, really, wow, they're capable of such things. I mean, is it possible that an entire generation of Arab would be anything but the bin Ladens that everyone thought every Arab is a small, growing bin Laden ought to be? Is it possible that Arabs are not just terrorists in the waiting? Is it possible that they are not just a demographic threat? Is it possible that this young generation is not a reservoir of extremism? Because as an observer, that's what I read. That's what I studied. Mostly Arabs were seen as the enemy, but the Arabs, individuals, and the new generation certainly was invisible. There's the idea of the threat. There's the idea of the enemy. But what actually Arabs were evolving to be, that was never really of an interest. And because there was such an ideological hold from these three security prisms, even those who tried to seriously research the Arab world had to be guided by those major guidelines that, we look at the Arab as not a very pleasant phenomenon. So that when millions of people poured to the streets of the Arab world, unarmed with weapons, but armed with new technology, armed with universal values, terribly courageous, facing some of the worst repressive and the most infamous security services with their bodies and with their spirits, not to be broken, being able to transform and to take on some of the most repressive security services in the world, some of those repressive and oppressive dictators, within days turning someone like Mubarak or Ben Ali and so on and so forth. That certainly was not in the cards. Not for those who saw the Arabs as enemies. Not for those who the Arab meaning an entire generation of Arabs, were invisible. So the promise really comes from those who have become visible to us. Thanks to media, thanks to new media, satellite media, and so on and so forth. A new generation of Arabs have become visible. And a new generation of Arab really did surprise. They also surprised themselves, to be honest. And this was an incredible year. In a country like Yemen, for example, a country of 22, 23 million people, where reportedly there are something like 50 to 70 million pieces of weapons in the hands of people there. Armed society. I mean, NRA would have a field day in Yemen. I mean, if you think, Texas and Denver does, or Wyoming, until you go to Taiz or whatever. But when the revolution started there, and when it actually continued there, persisted, the young generations of Yemenis would be demonstrating unarmed, and they would contain an entire area, large area, miles of squares and streets and boulevards and so on and so forth, making sure that no one goes in to their demonstrations armed. And be able to stage such a forceful opposition to a dictator who's been there since 1978, and been able even to confront some of the tendencies among some of the tribes to arm the revolution in Yemen. And Yemen is just an example. I just came back from Tunisia and Egypt. I mean, what I describe in the book as the miracle generation is really miraculous in the way it organized, in the spirit in which it organized, in the brilliance in the way it networked, in the way it proposed slogans simplified so everyone can understand, in the way they brought in everyone else from the society, in the way it brought men and women. I mean, the women in the public squares in the Arab world were more prominent than anywhere else in 20th century Arab world. It was there with this new generation that where gender became part and parcel of their approach, of their revolution, where really young men and women were able to lead, where they were able to take on dictators within days. This is the promise of the Arab Revolution. The promise of the Arab Revolution is 70% of its people, almost 70% of its people, are under the age of 30. Within few years, these are the people who are going to be leading in the Arab world. There is absolutely no escape from that. As one bright intellectual told me in Egypt just a few days ago, she said, you know, what's happening today in the Arab world is just a bunch of, you know, people associated with the past, a bunch of old people associated with the past, killing a lot of young, innocent, and courageous people. In a way, what this novelist was talking about is not a question of age. It was a question of, are you associated with a repressive dark past, or are you associated with a bright new future? And I think this new miraculous generation is leading the way towards something far more universal, far more just, not just for themselves, but actually for the region in general. Now, unfortunately, they are confronted by countless counter-revolutionary forces, by some of the old structures, by what the late Hisham Sharabi would explain brilliantly, the patriarchal structures in the Arab world, the politicized old oligarchies that are trying to maintain position, that are trying to defend themselves in the most violent of ways, whether they are religious or whether they are tribal, whether they are sectarian, whether they are regional, whether they are military. There's a number of forces now in the Arab world trying to slow the revolution, trying to confront the revolutionary spirit in the Arab world. And certainly the leading among them are the remnants of the old regimes, the old generals with the old mentalities, some regional powers, cynical regional powers, that will pursue national interest, the regime interest, at the expense of anything that is good or anything that is potentially good in that part of the world. And some of those regimes think it is a question of life and death of their rule. And for some of them who think or have established a straight structure whereby family, tribe, regime, and state is one and the same. So for them, the removal of the family, the removal of the dictator, the removal of the tribe, means the removal, meaning the undoing of the country, the undoing of the state. So actually the notion of me or the flood becomes a reality for some of those regimes. That if you want to take me on, if you want to take me down, I'm going to bring down the country with me. For some of them, there is this built-in anxiety that there is no other option. Meaning, and I'm not just talking about going to exile or having clemency somewhere or finding refuge somewhere. No, I'm talking about really, from the beginning, finding a way that is good for everyone, meaning, okay, I got the message, I got it, I heard it in Tunisia, I heard it in Egypt, and you know what? I'm starting the reform seriously. And I'm giving myself 1 year seriously. And I will make sure that everyone around me will be part and parcel of the future seriously. And this is not a game, and this is not a maneuver, and it's not just a way to waste time or to gain time in order to break whatever potential change coming in my way. No, but seriously, a way to pave the way forward. That there is a third way. that even dictators could be part and parcel of a movement towards change if they have ever gotten the message. Unfortunately, old habits die hard. And so for many of them, the idea that a new way is possible in the region didn't ring well, didn't bode well. And so what we see, and what we will probably continue to see, is an incredible beginning getting complicated. A non-violent revolution becoming violent. A swift change for, if not democracy, at least elections, and, an open process, independent judiciary, where a dictator can be put on trial. That a swift beginning, that bright beginning, now is complicated into various compromises and, of course, the interventions of regional powers and international powers. And really the talk of war and military intervention and militarizing the revolution is becoming so sickening that for many, the beginning is becoming or is getting to fade away, which is unfortunate. So when you do a balance sheet, of course, for many who are watching, for example, what's happening today in Syria, wouldn't be all too optimistic about the Arab revolutions. And here, I think, is a major question for us to be able to answer today. If you're looking at the short term, if you're looking at what is happening on every passing Friday in Homs or in Taiz, I think you're probably going to be disappointed. But if you're looking at the long term and what has opened up in that region, if you look at the collective consciousness now in the region, you will see that the forces of social justice are on the rise, are on the offensive. That the youth, despite everything, remain to be vocal and on the offensive. In places like Egypt, in places like Tunisia, in places like Yemen, it's the infamous generals that are on the defensive. Even though they continue to maneuver their way into maintaining power, even if they continue sometimes to dictate what goes on in the country. But when you look at the long term, when you look at the graph, you will see that despite the terrible news, despite the fact that we need to fasten our seatbelts the next few years, maybe more, that this is a generational question. That this will not happen in a year or two. This was going to need a generation or two to bring the real change. But at least they have started on the right way. It will take a lot from a lot of us, especially in the Arab world. Intellectuals will need to be visible now. Those who long been invisible, the human rights activists, the community organizers, who actually built up the evolution towards the revolution, are going to have now to play center role. Because it's going to take more than political revolution in the Arab world. It's going to take social revolution, economic revolution. It's going to take a revolution the way go about their daily lives, in the culture in the Arab world. And that's going to take time. And that's going to take new voices, or the invisible voices becoming visible. And certainly they could use all the help they could get from the outside. So all in all, I would say that the balance sheets on the short term might be complicated and a bit problematic, but I am not myself nowadays. I remain hopeful, optimistic, that I think the long term is going to bode well for the region. And I thank you.
Well, thank you very much. We're going to begin with our Q&A session now. And for questions in this room, just wait for a moment till the microphone gets to you. But I also wanted to remind those watching online that this would be a good time to send in your questions if you have them. We'll try to relay them to our speaker. I think I want to start with a question that we sort of started discussing a little bit earlier, and Marwan suggested that I pose it now. What do you think, working for Al Jazeera, obviously you have a sort of an inside view on this. What do you think the coverage of the Arab Spring, and particularly the different revolutions, maybe most prominently Syria in recent months, how has that affected the reputations of the different networks? And what kind of effect is that going to have in the short term and the long term on the way people view different sources of media?
It's we're back to the question of visibility, right? And certainly, I think the most important factor, aside from the very personal and human factor, I mean, people going out there and dying for their cause, people going out there and getting imprisoned and tortured for their cause, which we've seen that in the Arab world for many years, and we've seen that over the last year. Aside from that factor, meaning Arabs at the fore of their struggle for freedom, I think satellite media played probably that second important factor, because it made the invisible visible. This started almost 2 decades ago. In the early 90s to the mid-90s, Al Jazeera, of course, came to existence in the mid-90s, and Al Arabiya, for example, soon after that. And since then, we had several hundred satellite networks in the Arab world. And those satellite networks were able, for the first time in the history of the region, make the Arabs visible to one another across borders. That people from Morocco to Iraq were able to debate, to discuss, to exchange information, advice, brainstorm, and so on and so forth. This did not happen before. So in the evolution of the revolutions, there has been a virtual public space in the Arab world. And that virtual public space has been the satellite media networks. And they played an important role in making that journey towards the revolutions. So when the actual revolutions started in places like Tunisia and Egypt and went into Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, and so on, I think de facto, many of the people who were part of the media business, if you will, the visibility business in the Arab world, were excited about the revolutions. In a 24/7 coverage of revolutions that are ongoing, sometimes accuracy suffers. How you cover, when you cover, are you embedded with both the Gaddafi forces and the revolutionary forces or not? How do you call them? You call them revolutionaries, you call the others military, you call them militias. How you cover the video clips that are coming out from various places in the Arab world. When you do that, and you definitely want to capture what is going on, 2 things happen at the same time. One, you become a force to be reckoned with as satellite media. So just as you played an important role in the evolution to the revolution, suddenly you become a very an indispensable player in the revolutions themselves. And here, by the way, in my first conclusion in the book, conclusion of sort, I talk about the certain postmodernism about the revolution. And what do I mean by that? It was a bit paradoxical how, with the existence of new media and satellite media, people demonstrating, for example, in Tahrir Square or in Daraa in Syria, Homs, whatever, they would be demonstrating, then they will be taking pictures. So the citizen revolutionary becomes the citizen journalist. And as they take pictures, they send the pictures to satellite televisions. Satellite television picks up the pictures, and a lot of times when they are verified or not so well verified, they diffuse them, they broadcast them. So those citizen journalists who just sent their thing, they actually watch themselves back on their iPhone So you have a full cycle. You demonstrate, you take pictures, you send the pictures out, the pictures come out from the satellite, you actually can watch yourself demonstrating. It almost creates a narcissistic aspect to what goes on. If it was a different domain, I would say you're the judge, the jury, whatever, etc. Well, here you are the scene, you are the object, you're the subject, you're the transmitter, you're everything. And so media started to play a huge role in motivating people, in connecting people with other people, in connecting people with themselves. They became visible to themselves. This was something that we've seen before, by the way, in the Intifada, in the Palestinian Intifada in 2000, where people will go out and do whatever they did in their uprising in West Bank and Gaza, and go home in the evening and watch themselves on TV, which motivates them to go out the second day and get on television again. Now, by playing a role or by being an indispensable factor in the revolution, of course, that is not exactly problematic, but it puts the journalists, it puts the media outlets in a place where a lot of media outlets prefer not to be. Meaning, you definitely want to be completely out of whatever the question is here, dictators versus dictated, for example. To be able to be able to report the story without being part and parcel, or without de facto being considered to be on the side of, in this case, de facto, the revolutionaries. Now, are a lot of the journalists themselves sympathetic to the revolutions that I've seen? Yes. Does that interfere in their professional work? I've seen that happen a lot. Is that great? No. Could it be avoided? It should be more and more avoided. Do the networks then do everything right? Well, that would be divine. They're not. They're human. Did they make a lot of mistakes? They certainly did. Were the mistakes policy? For example, on the parts of Al Arabiya or Al Jazeera or whatever? I don't think so. At least from my own experience, a lot of the things that were happening, for example, how we covered Libya. If I looked retroactively, how did the Arab media cover Libya? I don't know. I'm not sure how much grade. I think my grade will not be 10 on 10. How are we covering Syria? Well, we don't have journalists in Syria. We actually don't have access on the ground in Syria. So whatever way we're going to describe or we're going to evaluate our coverage of Syria, it's going to have to be based on some other criteria than covering on the ground in Syria. In the end of the day, I think a lot about the role of media, their credibility, their role, and so on and so forth in the Arab Revolution is going to be left to history. For the time being, what is certain is that they are playing, as I said earlier, probably the most important role in the persistence of those revolutions. I would even go further and say, and here maybe, I have to be careful how I choose my words, but I'm not going to be. I'm not sure if there would be Assyrian revolutions without satellite media. Meaning, there's something so reinforcing, there's something so visible about coverage, especially using the new tools of social new media, that what we saw, for example, in early 1980s in Hama, meaning where the regime can take on thousands of people, regardless of the circumstances, why they did that and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to fault anyone here. But could take on and kill thousands of its own citizens with very few facts going out to the rest of the world. Now, this is impossible. Actually, now there's so much possibilities for coverage because everyone has a telephone. Everyone can take pictures. And paradoxically, as I try to explain in the book, the person who made sure that everyone has a telephone is the president's cousin and brother-in-law. Because he runs the phone company in Syria, and he's the one who tried to make a lot of money out of it.
Thank you very much for that. Let's start right here in the back, and if you could just keep your question brief so we can get as many in as we can. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, Honor to Borgrab, CSIS. We used to think the BBC was probably the best for foreign coverage around the world. I now think that Al Jazeera has taken their place. BBC's cutting back and you're expanding. And better than CNN International. And I was just wondering, how goes that battle, trying to get into more markets in the United States, and how severe is the opposition?
Is this CSIS position or yours?
I'm sorry?
Is this CSIS position or yours?
No, I was for 62 years.
Yeah. No. I don't know if you followed the recent news from London, but Al Jazeera just won the best news network of the year against BBC and Sky, I think. So the Royal TV Association or something like that. Royal Television Society, thank you. I don't really care what the British think, but anyway. Oops, did I just say that on the camera? No, I'm kidding. But really, a jury made of a number of British journalists and former journalists and so on decided, for whatever reason, that this year Al Jazeera beats Sky and BBC. And I think that's important for them to admit that. I was there on the RTCA dinner awards, etc., 2 years ago, and I would have thought that our coverage of Gaza and Israel in 2008 merited for us to win then the best channel of the year, because we were the only channel, and I think this goes to your point, it was the only channel in the world that covered the Israel war in Gaza from Gaza and Israel. No one else did. And that was the event of the year. And the idea that we are actually, everyone is saving money and trying to cover, I don't know what, Al Jazeera is expanding. And certainly expanding in this country, by the way. And Al Jazeera now in the United States has bureaus in Miami, in Los Angeles, I think soon in Chicago, Detroit, certainly New York, Washington. We're probably soon going to have more real direct bureaus than some of the US networks, have bureaus. Certainly around the world we do. We have something like, I think by now, actually I'm losing track of it. The last time I looked, were something like 80 bureaus around the world. So certainly we are expanding. I think it's something to the line what Hillary Clinton said recently into the Senate, that perhaps the American networks need to walk on Al Jazeera's path, because what Al Jazeera tried to do recently, or since its inception, is to put journalism back into television. We're trying to put journalism back in television. And I think if I could add to her line, I would say the following. We do it by doing also people's journalism. What a lot of the networks are doing less of, a lot of the networks, and if you allow me, I'll just expand one more minute about that. A lot of the satellite networks, the English-spoken satellite networks, are run by powers of sort, or associated with powers of sort. So Russia Today, France 24, CCTV, Sky, BBC, CNN, etc., and even Press TV, for the emerging powers, are all speak to or associated with or run their narrative as part and parcel to a certain regional or international power. Al Jazeera doesn't. So indeed, we have a different approach to journalism. We are not like the BBC. And you remember, I don't know, actually I did once a show about that. I mean, it used to be the voice of the empire. That's what BBC used to be called. The voice of the empire. And that's what was written on the BBC building, the voice of the empire. So certainly I think Al Jazeera is presenting a different sort of journalism out there.
But my question was really, what are you doing to expand your viewership in the United States? How many cities are you penetrating at present?
I'm not in the marketing distribution bit of it, but I can tell you two things. One, that we are, as you probably know, we are in Washington, we are in New York, we are in, I think, somewhere a bit in Detroit here, in Vermont there. But my feeling is, and again, I'm not talking as a businessman or an administrator, as an analyst, I would tell you that I think our time has come in America. I think we will be. If I would bet on it, if I would put my money on it, I would say we will be very soon in the country.
Let's go right back here.
Yeah, says, it's me, Mike Springman. Would you comment on the American and the Israeli attempts to control and direct the Arab revolutions, notably, for example, say in Egypt, where the National Endowment for Democracy and the Republican and Democratic parties' foreign initiatives are engaged in guiding the country, let us say. Or in Syria, where according to Pepe Escobar, they transferred a number of American soldiers from Iraq and Afghanistan to Jordan to help manage perceptions of what was going on in the country.
I actually think, here, let me be a bit sober about this. I actually think it's normal for Israel and the United States, like it is for Iran, Turkey, and everyone else, to want to influence what goes on in the Arab world towards their national interest. That's a fair game. Let's say it. If it's not moral, if it's not legal, at least it's just, geopolitics. But what's interesting here is the credibility gap between rhetoric and reality. I remember back in, I think 2002, I still have the speech, Netanyahu's speech to AIPAC at the time. He made this really, I'm a political sociologist, so I'm kind of familiar with some of the rhetoric he was trying to share with his activists. And it was kind of weird that he started quoting Kant, right, left, and center, right, about perpetual peace and so on and so forth. Anyway, all to say that he was proposing that Israel and the United States could not take on the extremists in the Muslim world because, according to him, they are about 10 to 15% of the Muslim world, and that's more than 150 million. You can't kill them all. So he suggested that the United States and Israel needs to democratize the Muslim world. Okay, I don't know how, but at the time, of course, that went into the logic of the 2003 war and against Iraq and so on and so forth. Of course, as everyone knows, it backfired. So the idea of civilizing and democratizing the Arab world did not work until, of course, the Arabs on their own provided their own narrative of what their future is supposed to look like. Now, why am I saying that? It's because when in early spring 2011, when the demonstrations led to upheavals and upheavals led to revolutions, and suddenly Mubarak was tumbling and Ben Ali was tumbling, Barak was, Defense Minister Barak was in the States, and he told the Wall Street Journal, we need $10 billion in order to confront the changes going on in the Arab world. I thought they wanted democracy in the Arab world. I thought they wanted democracy in Palestine. And there were no elections then in Egypt or Tunisia. Still, the idea that there's going to be democratic change in the Arab world, Israel now needs $10 billion from the United States to confront the change. So the question here for me, it's not so much about whether you're going to manipulate, how you're going to manipulate, where you're going to manipulate. And certainly, for example, on the question of the NGOs, and it remains to be seen what it is exactly. I think the gap between what Washington and Tel Aviv are saying they want and between the way they are handling it in reality is problematic. So you would say, you would remain supportive of the military generals in Egypt until something like the last fiasco happens. Then you say, those associated with the old regime and so on. But you actually made a deal with them to stay in power in order to offset the Muslim Brotherhood. You do the same thing in Yemen. You make sure that Ali Abdul Saleh sort of transitions himself peacefully and so on. His power, his sons, his tribe remains in the military and so on and so forth. And you bless that through Saudi Arabia and so on and so forth. So on the one hand, you speak of serious transition of democracy and freedom. On the other hand, you think of democracy and freedom as a burden to Israel's security, hence it needs money, to American policy and interest, hence it needs to affect it in, I think, the wrong way sometimes. So I think that's, for me, that's the thing I keep track of.
Come up front here, just 1 second. Right here, Henry.
Benjamin to Independent Analyst. Thank you very much. I'd like to follow up on your remarks regarding Israel and the difference between rhetoric and reality. At some point, even people who want a certain outcome and try to get that outcome either by preventing change or something come up against a reality, kind of an immovable force. So my question is, what lessons in a broader sense are the Israelis taking or are likely to take from the Arab Spring, and what will be the impact of these lessons for the Palestinians and their aspirations for a state of their own?
I would like to advance two concepts, and if I don't, I mean, it will take a long time to explain. So I'm just going to say that they are not as cliche as they might sound. That in fact, what I'm saying here is not simply stereotyping or generalizing. I'm actually saying something political. The revolutions in the Arab world are what I like to call the Palestinization of the Arab societies. Because what has happened in the Arab world over the last year, it is inspired, it is, in some cases like in Egypt, organized by those same groups that struggle for Palestine. I mean, just a quick thing just to tell you, for example, those who ended up organizing the Egyptian revolution through 2008, in 2011, the April 6 movement, so-called, before that Kifaya and so on and so forth, all of those political activists come from the popular committees for Palestine. All of them. When I was in Egypt in 2000 doing my book tour, my other book tour in Egypt, I was invited by the popular committees for Palestine. Those are the ones who became the revolutionaries of today, or their offsprings became the revolutionaries of today. So Palestine is actually intertwined, not only inspirationally, but also organizationally. Most of the people who struggle for freedom and justice in the Arab world did so for Palestine in previous times because they were allowed to do that for Palestine, but were not allowed to do that for their own domestic, for their own national, for their own societal freedoms and so on and so forth. I think Israel, on the other hand, and here I will use the word again very carefully, the Israelization of the Middle East today is exactly the antithesis of that. The Israelization of the Middle East today, as we see it unfold, for example, today on the question of Iran, as we see it unfold in the question of the West Bank and the peace process, as we see it in terms of blackmailing Washington on the question of what would you do for me if I don't attack Iran, and when will you promise me we will attack it together, and so on and so forth. That certainly complicates a peaceful transition towards social justice and freedom in the Arab world. Because as the old Swahili proverb says, you know, when elephants fight, the grass gets crushed. When they make love, the grass gets crushed. So any militarization, any serious intervention, any notion of Israel and the United States now turning the region into some kind of a, you know, power keg of sort, you know, an explosive, which is already, by the way, happening on its own independently, you know, with the question of Syria and so on and so forth, is quite problematic. So what you would hope, the lesson you would have hoped that people would, you know, would conclude is this region is going in the right direction, I'm going to help. Because you know what? A democratic Arab world can only be good for peace and justice in the area, and everyone will get its part. A democratic Arab world in civic societies, it will no longer be a question of Christian Jews and Muslims, it will be a question of citizenship. It will be a question of good relations among peoples, among states. It will be a commonwealth of some sort, you know, among those countries, because everyone now is going to need the other. Because unlike dictators that had to use populist discourse and domestic repression in order to separate from the others and anchor their rule, I think democracies in the region will probably aspire for something completely different. Unfortunately, countries and security organizations and so on and so forth don't think that way. They think, okay, now there is change, so I'm going to hold all my cards close to my chest. I'm going to make sure no move is done until I know where this thing is going, which by itself then complicates where things are going.
So in the short run, nothing, but in the longer run, perhaps some acceptance.
Yes. I think Palestine will most probably suffer on the short term because Arabs are going to be busy with their own internal changes and so on and so forth. I think the whole question of lack of American role, pressure, etc., on Israel, that also is going to complicate things. The rise of the Israeli right and the hold on power there, I think, will make it very difficult for things to move in the right direction.
Okay. There's a couple questions we have. Why don't we take the three of them together so we have a chance to respond? If you could just give us your question. I know you've been waiting very patiently, briefly, so we could take the other two as well.
This is basically to pick up on what this gentleman in the back and this one said just a few minutes ago, which, given the large, the extensive Western, British and U.S. military intervention in Libya and the threat thereof in Syria, given what Secretary Clinton has been saying, how do you see this as boding for the progress of the revolutions in both countries?
And then right here and here as well.
Could you comment on the invisible Arab in the Gulf states?
And since you mentioned these old ways of thinking here in DC or in the West generally, I think that these prisms, these three prisms you mentioned in the beginning, persist. But what will be the new prisms through which the West will begin to view the Arab world now that the Arab Spring has started and continues?
Well, I'm glad you asked this way this week, and at least we end on a positive note in DC. In principle, and here I speak not as Al Jazeera's analyst. I'm not, well, actually, even as Al Jazeera's analyst, but certainly personally speaking, I am against military interventions of any kind. I mean, short of a total global consensus to fend against genocide and so on and so forth, I am against military interventions. I think at one point the jury was out on the question of Libya. It turned out later on that a lot of the information on which the intervention was based were wrong, were disinformation, which leaves, a good space for problematic revisionist thinking about it. On the other hand, the idea that NATO, especially some of the former colonial powers like France and Italy and Britain, would be the ones carrying the military interventions, not presumably that global effort that was sanctioned by UN Security Council, is also problematic. And I think will spill problems in the long term. In some ways, this wasn't much of an Arab Spring, it was more of a NATO Spring. That at last NATO had some role to play, and of course 20, 30,000 Libyans would die in the process, so it wasn't really much of protecting the Libyan people. But they got rid of Gaddafi, and things moved on in the right direction and so on and so forth. I think the casualties are too high, and I still think that even if those who think that this has worked, and I think it's questionable, it would be more of an exception to the rule rather than the rule for the future. I think certainly in the Gulf, the Arabs are less visible than they are elsewhere, for sure. And I think the question is going to come back to haunt a lot of the Arab monarchies today, and especially in places where it's more problematic in terms of the lack of political parties, the lack of pluralism, the lack of freedom of expression, and so on and so forth. Saudi Arabia started by some shy, very, very shy steps, such as women joining the consultative council and so on and so forth. But I think the Gulf is going to have to come with the goods, especially the Gulf countries that talk heavily about the need for change and social democracy. People are going to ask them, or are asking them, wait a minute, what about you? So what are you going to do for change in your country? So I think that will have to come next, and I think the Gulf countries cannot be immune, and and the Gulf citizens cannot but be or become more visible than before. In terms of the prisms, I think the problem before is that we would go on every couple of decades looking at the region from this prism and then the other one. You would hope now the next 2 decades we will see it from different prisms, and that is the prisms of the capacity of the Arabs as humans to want freedom and justice just as people in this country want it. Meaning, and that's I've been asked about, as I was telling you earlier, radios are kind of a very interesting phenomenon in this country. They're far more interesting than television. And various radio stations, various parts of the country ask very different questions. They have very different perspectives. But few of the sort of more on the right radio hosts were kind of wondering, do you guys want the same thing like we do? They was almost going to start talking about sex and whatever. And I was trying to explain that Arabs have that, but also other things on their minds, that this was not specifically a libertarian, notion of when we're going to be carrying our guns next. People are still having problems with that. How to be able to see people in the Arab world wanting the same things, and why a Muslim Democrat is not very different from a Christian Democrat, and why if Muslim Brotherhoods win, it is not the end of the world. Just like Christian Democrats won in other parts of Europe, in part, just like evangelists in this country play a major important role in the country. And that's why Kate Ireland is invited to APAC this weekend, because she's a good evangelical voice in the country, powerful one. So I think if this country could go beyond the phobic, securitarian vision of the Arab world, if they would really just allow themselves to open up to the possibilities that the Arabs, like the East Europeans, like the Latin Americans, want the same thing like people around the world want. Now, they could stutter, they could tumble on the way, but it's clear what this young generation wants. And the investment needs to be in this young generation. That this is not going to be an easy ride. And it's not clinical. It is not sterile. There is no prescription. And actually, I was just telling that story when I came, I'll end with that, from overseas, just coming here to DC. I took a 15-hour flight, and people always tend to ask me, what did I think of the flight? So you have this form you fill, point of departure, point of arrival, stopovers, how was the meal, how was the service, the security, the convenience, and so on and so forth, right? And I got to be professional on this. I don't know, as I said, they always ask me to fill it. But checking the points for a revolution is not like checking the points for a flight. That's what a lot of the people, not just in government, but people in this country will need to understand. That there is no point of departure and point of arrival. There is no promised land in the Arab Revolution. There might be, for some, a promised land in the Holy Land, but there is no promised land when it comes to the Arab revolutions. That there are no limited stopovers and there are no good meals on the way. And we don't know how the security is going to be, and we don't know how tipsy-turvy the trip is going to be. Revolutions are judged differently. They are not a 15-hour thing. They're not a 15-day or week or month thing. What's his name? That Chinese, and I go into I book again about that. Xu Enlai, I think, when he was asked 100 years after the French Revolutions in the 50s, what did he think of the French Revolution 100 years later? He said, "It remains to be seen." Thank you.